So, the latest episode of Fruits Baskets dropped, and it was really good. First up, I gotta say, I love the new intro and outro. The songs were great, the animation was colourful, vibrant and exciting, and it just fits the show to a T. Having an intro and outro that just reflects the show so well really helps you get hyped up for each episode. This week continued the trend of getting more in-depth character development for some of the secondary characters, like in the last couple weeks. But unlike those episodes where plot progression was sort of put on hold a little bit to take a detour and expand the scope of the world, we had a lot of meaningful progression this episode. The episode opens following Yuki's reflections on Rin and his limited interactions with her. In his memory, she comes across as uncaring, distant and cold, which isn't really too different to how she's been portrayed in the show so far. It's revealed that she and Haru would visit Yuki in his isolation, and whilst Haru would sit and talk with him, Rin would just sit in the doorway silently before abruptly leaving. For Yuki, this proves confusing, and he doesn't really understand why she'd visit if she didn't even care. For me, this scene proves why Yuki is the best choice of POV for introducing the character of Rin properly. If a character in the inner circle of the Soma family is so confused about the nature of this character, it adds to her air of mystery and builds her up in a way that having Toru ponder things wouldn't. Next up, we finally follow Toru's POV again as she gets a phone call from her aunt telling her that her grandfather's collapsed and has a strained back, and therefore he can't go to her parent-teacher conferences. Out of nowhere, Shigure appears and snatches the phone, agreeing to go to the parent-teacher conference in her grandfather's place and setting up a visit for the next day. I like that we're starting to see more of the caring and cheeky side of Shigure again. It just reaffirms that he's not just a manipulative jerk and he does actually care to some extent. Then Kyo comes home and he's all distant and clearly troubled. This is a running theme throughout the episode, but it isn't really addressed in too much depth, so I guess it's planting the seeds for future stuff. The next day we see Toru and the gang chilling and going to have some drinks. Yuki and Haru begin to talk about Rin, and Haru speculates that maybe Rin did mean what she said in the hospital. This is the beginning of a misdirection. The episode wants you to think that Rin's cold and calculating and cruel, that she doesn't care about those around her, even people she's supposedly close to. We then transition to the Soma estate, and more specifically Yuki's house, where he delivers a letter to the maids to give to his mother in regards to the parent-teacher conferences. We learn from the maids and from Yuki's thoughts that his mother's almost never at home, so already that's planting more seeds as to what she's going to be like. Although I think it was already obvious that she wasn't going to be winning Parent of the Year awards considering Yuki's so traumatized by his childhood. After a brief conversation between Kagura and Yuki, where Yuki actually shows concern about Kyo for once and reveals his envy that Kagura can feel so deeply without any doubts, we finally get to the main element of the episode, Yuki's meeting with Rin. Now this is what I meant before, that they were trying to set up the audience to find Rin distasteful before revealing that she has far more depth than was previously realised. It's revealed that all this time, she's been protecting Haru, and that's why she used to sit in the doorway. Then Haru turns up, they smooch, she slaps, then she runs off. And I found this very refreshing. A lot of the time when characters are built up and the only hints we have of them are negative, they turn out to be villainous or antagonistic characters. But in this case, we ended up with the opposite. A character that's abrasive on the surface, but's good underneath it all. And I think it's even more refreshing that instead of suddenly being nice and everything getting resolved, she doubles down and keeps her walls up. To finish off the scene, Haru tells Yuki not to worry about Rin, that he should focus on his own life and what matters to him. For Yuki, this is hard because he feels as if he needs to somehow give back to all those who've helped him, and not to focus on his own happiness. Haru acknowledges that Yuki's weak and needs help, but that's one of his great qualities. That he does need help and will accept it. That he doesn't put on a front of toxic masculinity. It was a really powerful scene, and I swear that Haru is becoming a wise old sage more and more as the season progresses. We finish off following the rest of Toru's storyline, and there's so much to be said for this scene. It was so incredibly deep in the shaping of her character. Her granddad lamenting the deaths of his son and daughter, talking about how he dreams of them and how he wishes he could see them again even as ghosts, was so tragic. It's this tiny old man lying in bed kind of wishing he was dead. Wishing that he could be with the people he misses most in the world before falling back asleep. Toru then sort of has a mini breakdown. We get some more glimpses on how much being orphaned has actually affected her. She remembers her mother wishing to see her father the same way her grandfather's just lamented for his son in front of her. We already know what kind of things her mother's death's done to her, but it's interesting to see the glimpses of her father's death and how that trauma still lingers in the back of her mind and begins to trigger her a little. And to me it felt like she still has a huge fear of being alone and abandoned. To me it seems like her traumas led her down the path of being so overly nice and sweet and accommodating to ensure that people don't try and leave her, to try and make herself as little a nuisance as possible and to give so much to others to ensure their happiness and hope they'll remain by her side. Then we have Kyo find her in the street, which I believe is very telling for this scene. Despite her attention and build-up of his esteem, their relationship is pretty different to any other. He's one of the few characters that sees her in a different light, a vulnerable person who also needs love and attention. He even mentions how physically vulnerable she appears. It shows that he's the only character that really seems to see her as an individual with her own needs, rather than as a strong character that can take on anyone's burdens. All in all, this was a great episode. I feel like I say this every week, but this was probably one of my favourites of the season. I like how we're starting to see the plot push forward again, but still keep developing some of the smaller characters, and I hope it keeps going like this for the rest of the season. I'm looking forward to next week and reading some of your thoughts on this week's episode. Let me know what you think.